From the Toronto Star, I'm Raji Mudder, and this matters. Teaching is the one profession that creates all other professions. After almost 2 years of disruption to schools, moving from in-class learning to virtual or hybrid models, and fears of classrooms becoming super spreader events, we have heard a fair bit from parents and their concerns for their kids in the education system. Teachers are also part of that equation, and one where we are just learning now to the extent how much the pressure of the pandemic has affected them. It has caused stress and burnout and other issues, with many taking short-term leaves to help deal with their mental health struggles, which, in turn, further causes stress on the entire education system. Nadine Yousif is a reporter covering mental health issues for The Star. She recently took a look at some of the issues teachers are facing and joined us to discuss. Nadine, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Nadine, I think we've heard a fair bit from stressed out parents and a lot about the worrying effects on children during this pandemic. But now you've got some information on teachers and the toll that this is taking on them. What did you find?
Yeah, so we are into the second school year, full school year under the COVID-19 pandemic. So now we have some data from 2020-2021 school year about sick leaves and basically how teachers fared out in that period of time. What we do know now is that sick leaves for teachers who were gone for 3 months or longer are up exponentially at most of the public school boards in the Greater Toronto Area. We also know that, through some research by Mental Health Research Canada, which is a charity that has been monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on Canadians' mental health throughout the pandemic. They also found that self-reported anxiety among teachers increased 53%, which is higher than any other profession. But they did also notice higher levels of resilience, but it was something stark and they noted it out. The other thing, too, is that researchers in Brock University are starting to look at this as well. Basically, it stemmed out of research that they were doing on youth. And what they sort of noticed with the youth that they were speaking to was that the youth were worried about their teachers, and it kind of kept coming up in conversation. And so they decided to sort of pivot their research and actually talk to teachers themselves through one-on-one interviews to see what was sort of going on with how teachers were feeling during the pandemic. And they actually found many to be displaying symptoms that were consistent with that of burnout. The research is still preliminary, but with the interviews that they've done so far, that's what they found is just consistent burnout.
Okay, so first off, I'm supposed to believe this, the kids actually care about their teachers?
Yes, yeah. That's when something that they really noticed,
I'm joking. And I'm sure, listen, we've all had good and bad teachers through our life. And it is really interesting that it's the kids' perception that sort of started this. So it's funny, the term you used, burnout. Is that the best term for this? It's kind of like a really big sort of catch-all. What kind of issues and symptoms are we talking about here?
Yeah, so this is not the first time I report about teacher mental health. I did a similar sort of story last year when the 2020-2021 school year began, so around October. So I've spoken to a lot of teachers throughout the last few months, and there's some symptoms that have sort of come up. Some talked about difficulty sleeping, having muscle aches, sleepless nights, tossing and turning, all of that stuff. Some talked about general anxiety, about COVID-19, catching COVID, feeling increasingly helpless about the current situation that they were in, feeling unsupported. For some, especially if they have physical health conditions that are already existing, like heart issues that can get exacerbated by stress, that has happened, which has forced some to go on leave. For others, if they have a history of struggling with anxiety and depression, that's gotten worse. They've talked about having more difficulty coping, displaying frustration, having emotional outbursts, just not feeling like themselves and not being able to come to terms with the challenges that the pandemic has sort of presented. And, honestly, a lot of teachers kind of said that they don't have the love that they used to have for the job anymore, which is probably the most indicative thing of burnout. It's sort of like waking up every morning and dreading starting the day. Whereas before it was something that they loved. I mean, a lot of teachers will tell you they don't do it for the money. So it's definitely something that they've noticed happening more and more over the course of the pandemic.
I kind of want to break down some of these because I think some of these are very understandable. I mean, let's just start like we're in a pandemic before vaccinations. And even now, teachers of younger children who can't be vaccinated, catching COVID has got to have been a huge stress for all these kids. And then also, I mean, a lot of schools had trouble with PPE and like that's got to be an exacerbating situation throughout this, just as a starter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always fear of COVID. It's still happening right now. And, in some classes, it's hard to do the social distancing, especially if you're teaching kindergarten, for example. So that's definitely been something that's come up for sure.
Now, the other thing is this hybrid learning plan. This sounds like something that everybody hates. So first, let's explain a little bit about what it is and what, from the teacher's side, the issues are.
Yeah, so hybrid learning is something that's happening across many high schools in the GTA. It's also happening at some elementary schools, and notably at the York Region District School Board. Basically, what it is that teachers are teaching students online and in person simultaneously. So they'll have like 20 or so students in the classroom and maybe 10 or so students online, give or take. And kids are really struggling with that. They're not able to interact with the classroom in the same way that the kids in person are. And some teachers have noticed that if they have kids that are struggling with their mental health, a lot of them tend to be the ones that are online. And they feel like they can't be there to support them because A, they can't see them in person. They can't pick up on those little things that can indicate that a child is struggling or, a high school student is struggling. At the same time, they can't bring them into the classroom meaningfully and get them to interact with the kids in person meaningfully because of that, big barrier. They're sort of just tuning in on the screen, right? And so that's really been frustrating for teachers. And, across boards, they've tried to bring this issue up time and again, asking for school boards to end this hybrid learning model because of how they've noticed it's impacting their students. But that hasn't happened so far. It's still ongoing.
Nadine, you talked to a number of teachers, and one feeling they shared was a sense of helplessness in terms of being there for their students. One aspect of that was the sort of firsthand look that they got into some of the inequality in their classroom among their students. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of teachers have spent last year teaching online because of pandemic mandated shutdowns and rising COVID-19 cases. And so, they had a distinct look into the lives of their students that they haven't had before, seeing where they live, things like that. Some teachers sort of noticed the inequality that exists among their students. Some students are really well off, live in good homes, have access to internet, all of that stuff. And some of their students live in motels or in low income housing. They have spotty internet connection. Some didn't even manage to log on for the entire year. And seeing that and not being able to do anything about it has really been impactful on the way that teachers feel about themselves, the way that they feel about their role and their responsibility and the impact that they have on their students. And that's sort of, been carried over into this school year. Yes, kids are back in person and teachers are teaching in person again. But for those kids that are still online, there's still that disconnect. And when kids kind of come across and say they're struggling with their mental health, teachers are feeling like they have nowhere to sort of point them to, or they don't even have the mental reserve or capacity to really be there for them beyond just directing them to external services. So yeah, it's certainly been a struggle. And then seeing those students that haven't come back or seeing those students come back that haven't been online for the past year or so, and noticing how behind they are in their education has also been really difficult for teachers to sort of grapple with. So again, it kind of comes back to this sense of identity and moral failure and them not being able to grapple with how to fulfill their roles under the pressures of the pandemic.
We'll be right back. So, you mentioned it earlier, and a lot of this obviously sounds anecdotal, but you talked about these numbers about leaves growing exponentially. Can you talk a little bit about those and then what kind of stress that's putting on the education system?
Yeah, so what we do know, we have data from the largest public school boards in the Greater Toronto Area. So we have Toronto District School Board, York Region District School Board, and Peel Board as well. And throughout all three of them, we have seen that the number of sick leaves have more than doubled from 2019-2020 to 2020-2021. The issue is, and the caveat with this data, is that we actually don't know how many have left due to stress or mental health related symptoms, because teachers and boards have told me that the paperwork actually doesn't distinguish between physical health and mental health ailments. So even the boards at a larger capacity don't have that data readily available to see how many of their staff are really struggling with burnout. But unions do say that, talking to their membership, sort of understanding why teachers are leaving, many are leaving due to stress. So it's certainly something that is being observed. As for the stress that it's putting on the education system, we do know that last year, a lot of teachers that were on reserve, so supply teachers or guidance counselors, they were put into teaching positions. Now, that's largely because virtual learning meant that they needed more teachers to be teaching in the classroom, like in the virtual classroom. So that's the reason why. But going into this year, it's still early to kind of tell, but what we are seeing or what we're hearing from on the ground from teachers is that there is a teacher shortage. Administrators like principals and things like that are on call in case that they need to sort of fill in when need arises. And teachers do see a lack of support in the terms of the number of staff that they have in the school. So it's still very much an ongoing issue. And unions sort of back that up and say, a higher number of teachers are still on leave versus what it was before the pandemic.
I can only speak personally, but my child's school has had a principal that they pulled out of retirement for the first couple months. And now the regular one, I believe, is coming back. So I have seen that. I can confirm that. Let's be very blunt about this. Are teachers actually quitting? Do we know that?
Yes. So, for example, we do have data from the York Region District School Board as an example. Last year, resignations and retirements were up about 50 or so from pre-pandemic numbers across the board. And then at Peel, unions were saying that they have seen higher numbers of resignations and early retirements. When we say high numbers, we're talking about a handful more, but it is something that's noticeable because when they do ask people, why are you resigning early or retiring early? A lot of teachers say that it is tied to burnout and stress. The unions will tell you they haven't seen a mass exodus of teachers yet. That kind of ties back, researchers say, to the resilience piece. Teachers do love their jobs, and there is a lot of fulfillment that comes from it, especially when they see their students doing well. But the fear that teachers and their unions and I guess just overall supporters have is that, we are losing the next generation of educators if working conditions don't improve for teachers under this pandemic and beyond. The impact of the pandemic may have strayed some people who wanted to teach away from the profession entirely, and it might impact the next generation. And it may get worse if it doesn't get addressed. So that's the fear. That's why teachers are speaking out about how they're feeling.
What about support right now? I mean, what have you heard from the boards? How do we help these educators?
So interestingly enough, a lot of it comes down to funding education better, which is something that you hear teachers talk about time and again. But, teachers are sort of frustrated. They say the province hasn't really made education a priority throughout the pandemic. It has favored opening businesses over children's learning conditions, and that has to change. So this is sort of what teachers feel on the broader scale. How that materializes in the classroom, well, they want more support staff in schools, especially mental health support staff, because they're noticing a growing number of their students are struggling. And they want supports in place so that they don't feel like, it's just them alone sort of addressing these issues, especially when, for some, they feel like they're not qualified. They're not mental health professionals. They are the first point of contact for students, but there needs to be more than that. They want proper monitoring of burnout that the teachers are experiencing at the board level. So, for example, actually looking at the data and seeing how many teachers have been impacted by this, how many teachers have left due to stress-related issues, better supports that aren't just webinars. Some teachers kind of talked about how their boards will send them webinars that say, make sure to check in on your mental health, make sure you're eating healthy, sleeping well, all of that stuff. They want less barriers to accessing actual meaningful support that's not just sort of a Band-Aid solution. We talked about the hybrid model earlier. Most teachers I spoke with say the hybrid model is just not working, and doing away with it entirely will help tremendously, though it's something the boards have not yet moved to do. So these are some things that teachers say boards can move on immediately to sort of remedy the situation, but adding to the frustration is that nothing has sort of been done yet to address these concerns.
One of the things I found really interesting in your story is that as a parent, I was super glad in-school learning was back. From some of the teachers you talked to, they were still very anxious about that, and in some ways might have exacerbated their stress. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, the fear of COVID is still very much present. It's still something that teachers are worried about when they go into the school. One teacher I spoke with, and sort of just to backtrack a bit, a lot of teachers are also parents themselves. And so they deal with the fear of their kids coming home from school with COVID or them coming home from school, bringing COVID into their home environment. So one teacher I spoke with, for example, her kids did test positive for COVID, forcing them to self-isolate. And this was only a few weeks ago. And right now we're in November 2021. So COVID is still very much a big reality. A third of all the cases in the province are tied to school outbreaks. So we do know it's a huge sort of contributor to spread. And, teachers are worried, like kids under 12 are still not vaccinated and they're worried about themselves and their families. And for teachers, things like better PPE or better ventilation in schools can also go a long way to address that. So even with vaccine rates going up and teachers being vaccinated, there is still that fear, which is interesting.
Nadine, it's one of these things that I think a lot of people, they don't like to listen to hear teachers complain because they get summers off.
Yes.
And they have a strong union. Now, I'll be quite honest, it's not a job that I would ever want to do. And when you get a good teacher, there is nothing like it. And so I absolutely been incredibly happy with the support that my child has gotten at her school. That said, there's no one uniform thing for this. So I can understand all the issues that they've had to face over this past 2 years. Nadine, this has been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add on that point that you just mentioned. This is something that came up when I talked to teachers, that their profession is misunderstood, that people don't have sympathy for teachers. You notice it. If we write about teachers, sometimes the reaction will be, yeah, they get summers off and it's a good job. So why are they sort of frustrated? Why are they quote unquote complaining? To address that, they said that, the public really generally misunderstands their profession. That's how they feel. A lot of people think teachers get ample time off and it's an easy profession, but many say that it's one that's actually really difficult. Again, they don't do it for the money. It's a huge responsibility. They kind of see themselves acting in place of the parents of the children when they are in the classroom. And if they are struggling, then the teachers themselves are struggling. They say it's a reflection of how their students are feeling and their classroom conditions. So teachers' working conditions are children's learning conditions. And that's why teachers say that they should be listened to when they sort of raise concerns like this.
That's an excellent point. I really, really want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Nadine Yousif is a reporter covering mental health issues for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudder. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.